The name of my disease that I will be talking about today in my presentation is Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a pathogen that harms humans and causes people a multitude of problems. This is a condition that you can get in your community or even inside of a hospital. Treatment for these conditions caused by Staphylococcus aureus are very serious because sometimes the antibiotics may not work because of the various strains of the disease working against them. If this occurs, the doctors must find a way or some antibiotic that will work to kill the infection. The infection will not harm a person if it is on a healthy skin, and it must find a way into the body via a cut and usually from direct contact with the infection. It can also spread via food transmitters. If you touch food that somebody has got the infection, touches it, and you ingest it, you can also get it that way. So it has to be get into the body via some way. And when you get this infection, you need to be treated as soon as possible so you can stop the spreading of this, and that's one of the things we'll be talking about in this presentation. The scientific name of this organism, the genus is Staphylococcus, and the species name is Aureus. And the scientist who discovered Staphylococcus aureus was Alexander Oakstein in 1880. He was the first person to see these grape-like bunch of bacteria that was in the pus of a patient that he was treating that had a knee joint that became infected. And when he got to looking at it, he was able to figure out, to see that there was something strange there. And he named the material that he saw as Staphylococcus because it looked like a group of grapes. And it comes from the Greek word staphyle, and it was also a berry-like substance. And then in the Greek language, berry means coccus. And then Staphylococcus aureus has been around since, best that scientists can tell, it's been around since the beginning of time. And until Alexander Oakstein was able to discover it and find it up in 1880, really no one knew anything about this particular disease, and there's no telling through the years the people who have died from this disease up to that point. And luckily he was able to finally discover it. Then in 1884, Frederick Julius Rosenbach was able to start growing these organisms inside his lab, and then he saw that they were purple in color, and that allowed him to be able to categorize these Staphylococcus aureus due to their color. And with this discovery, it led to the discovery of the compound 606, which is a type of antibiotic that is in the form of a gold powder. So the people back then would put the gold powder onto their infection, and it would help to ease some of their symptoms and eventually cure them. This was founded by Paul Ehrlich in 1906 and was a huge thing for these people at that time. Then this was used until the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming on accident when he was studying Staphylococcus aureus, and thankfully he was able to take the Staphylococcus aureus and was able to extract this. And this was done by Howard Walter Florey and Ernest Boris Chain in 1939. And they were able to take the penicillin out from the Staphylococcus aureus that they had been growing, and able to take it and make the penicillin. At that time, they took the penicillin and they used it in 1941 when the war started, and they took it and was able to treat the wounded soldiers at that time. And because the penicillin was so successful in helping to treat the soldiers, they called it the miracle drug. because it was able to treat any kind of bacterial infections that they had gotten at that time. Fleming stated that using penicillin to kill Staphylococcus aureus was not an easy thing to do, even in the lab or dealing with humans. And as people became more and more resistant to these strains of bacteria, more people began to die, and scientists had to find another way, more antibiotics to treat these new infections. And that was one of the things that was troubling to them at that time, was how we're going to, these new strains, find these new types of ways to kill these strains. Staphylococcus aureus is found in the kingdom of bacteria. The phylum is Firmicutes, is in the class Cocci. It is found in the order Bacilles. It is found in the family Staphylococcaceae, and the genus name of it is Staphylococcus, and the species name is Staphylococcus aureus. The structure of Staphylococcus aureus is that the cell wall of the bacteria is covered with fibers that have a coat of fuzz over it. This fuzz that's found over the Staphylococcus aureus contains acids and proteins and was bound together by a tough bond. And this bond was able to hold all these things together within inside the Staphylococcus aureus. Scientists do not quite understand how the proteins and polymers that hold the cell wall together work, but they are studying it to try to figure out how they can make it work and figure out how we can better understand Staphylococcus aureus and able to, when it goes to the different strands of Staphylococcus aureus, how we're able to treat those for the patients that are coming in. The strains can manipulate, become a different strain so quickly, and they have to find new ways to treat those new strands. The fixation method that they use here works when scientists they use two types of methods: fixation method and a free substitution method. The fixation method is where the proteins are stabilized and the tissues of the cell are preserved. Then they use what's called a free substitution method, and this is where the tissues of the patients are stabilized so that scientists can study them using a microscope to get a better understanding of them. And that way, when you put them under a microscope, the scientists are able to see and be determined exactly what's going on and try to figure out how to treat these Staphylococcus aureus to help these patients out. The pathogenesis of Staphylococcus aureus can occur quite often if an individual has an open wound. If a person gets the infection in their lungs, it can lead to pneumonia or influenza even. Staphylococcus aureus can also live inside both or outside both the host cell. As they invade the host cell, they must overcome the antibodies which can kill them. So when you take antibiotics, you're wanting it to kill the Staphylococcus aureus. If it gets inside, it can cause, like I say, influenza or pneumonia or some other type of infection. For a person to survive, they must express a capsule on its surface, which is called protein A. Protein A has this clumping factor in it, and it also has inhibitors to help the Staphylococcus aureus to survive. The pathogenesis of Staphylococcus aureus infection has 5 different stages that they must go through. One of those is it wants to be colonized. Secondly, it likes to go through an infection process where it's contained only near the entry. So wherever the wound is, it likes to stay there at that entry point. Thirdly, they go through a process of sepsis, or like maybe going to septic shock. Fourthly, they go through toxinosis, and lastly, they go through an infection stage where the infection is deep-seated, meaning that it's really deep, and at this point you would actually need to maybe have some surgery to help get rid of that particular infection. Once the infection gets into the body, it can stay there for months before it may give you trouble, or it could give you trouble immediately. That depends on the individual. And once the disease begins to give you the trouble, it can gets into your body part, and it can cause you some major trouble. It can make you go into the hospital where you can stay weeks to months, depending on your problem. And once one type of problem that you can have that's common is called impetigo. And impetigo is something that I incurred when I was playing football back in middle school. It went through our locker room. Never heard of that before. I called impetigo. Luckily, the doctors were able to give me the antibiotics and get it treated, and I was able to get back to playing football before it spread. Of course, our coaches had to clean our locker rooms. Once you get the infection in your body and the treatments aren't working, then you could have what's called a sepsis set in, and this is where your organs begin to fail, or you could even go into shock, depending on the condition of yourself. The epidemiology of the Staphylococcus aureus is that it is one of the leading causes of infections all over the world. Epidemiology of Staphylococcus has seen a growing number of infections in the healthcare community, especially in people who have prosthetics and endocarditis. Scientists have also seen a growing number of patients who have a resistance to the antibiotics given to them once they contract Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacterium, and it affects over 30% of the world's population. It affects the skin of the patient and is one of the leading causes of skin-related problems throughout the world. Staphylococcus aureus is most prevalent in the industrialized world, and it usually affects between 10 to 30 per 100,000 people, which is quite a lot. It is most prevalent in the country of Ireland, and most of those were found in patients that had to have a catheter for their dialysis, or that even had diabetes. And what happened there is the infection they didn't clean the catheters properly, and that caused the infection to invade the body. This is and that's because the infection spreads by direct contact, and in this case, we've been with the improperly cleaned equipment. The treatment of Staphylococcus aureus is usually for the patient to take penicillin. Sadly, many countries have developed a resistance to this disease because Staphylococcus aureus somehow developed what is called penicillinase, and this has caused the penicillin not to work in many of the patients. So to combat this problem, doctors have to give the patients oxacillin or flucloxacillin. And if the patient has some type of major problems, the doctor can give them therapy in conjunction with the medicine, and depending on the severity of the problem, the treatment can take weeks to months, which is very dangerous for a lot of those people. Staphylococcus aureus can mutate into disease like MRSA, depending on what type of Staphylococcus aureus you have, depending on the treatment you would need in order to get better. I have had friends that have gotten Staphylococcus aureus before, and then depending on where it was and how severe the case they had, depending on what type of treatment. Fortunately, all of them got better, but a lot of them had to go to the hospital and had to stay a while, and it's something that's very, very scary. And then when I coached football myself, we had a case of staph infection went through our locker room. I wasn't very familiar with the staph infection at that time, even though I had impetigo. I didn't really correlate the two together. And several of our players got it, and we had to go through and we had to clean our locker room, wash our uniforms, and after that, I always made sure that our locker rooms were clean, and I always made sure that everything around us was clean. Everything had to be clean to the max. How you prevent Staphylococcus aureus is is to start by washing your hands regularly. You know, with everything going on today, washing your hands is a must. And you don't want to keep one way getting in the body is through your mouth, nose, eyes, etc. And by washing your hands, it cuts down on that. If a person develops a chronic wound, the patient would need to make sure that they keep the wound clean. If they do not keep the wound clean, then a biofilm could develop in the wound, allowing for bacteria to grow. And half of these wounds develop what's called staph infection in that area, or you can also get a flesh-eating bacteria. And Alex Smith was watching a documentary on him, and he developed a flesh-eating bacteria, and he plays quarterback for the Washington Redskins, and he almost lost his leg once that infection had set in. And then what happened was they thought they had it all clean, but apparently somehow they did not. And luckily they were able to save his leg, get him on some different antibiotics, and he was able to survive. Also, if the antibiotics aren't working, the doctors can go in and surgically remove the bacteria if needed. You have to make sure that the area is really, really clean, your equipment's clean, and also to prevent Staphylococcus aureus, you need to keep your clothes washed, very important. All the areas that you're working in are treated, cleaned, and make sure that all the coatings that you do allow for the biofilms attached to the surfaces. So if you, whatever you, like in the locker rooms, those type of surfaces have the coating so the biofilms can't attach to it and make it be a problem. Overall, Staphylococcus aureus is a very dangerous disease, easily spread, but with cleanliness and if you do get it treated quickly, it can be something that can be prevented. But you know, especially in today's light, where everything is, we're talking about cleanliness and things. It's one of the things, hopefully, that we can cut down on the amount of Staphylococcus aureus, staph infections, etc., being more prevalent in our society, and hopefully we can cut down on this and not have as many problems with it. Thank you so much. This is Randall Patterson, Bio 525. Thank you. Goodbye.